just want to speak to the professionalism of the exhibit and what the Babylon Village Historical Society is trying to put forth, not only this new display, but into the future. We want to become part of the community where we are not only involved with decoys, but we'll have many, many more different expositions into the future.
Thank you very much, and I would like to just say how much fun I've had for the last few months working with all these people I've met in the Historical Society. When I started, I didn't quite make the distinction between the village and the town of Babylon. So I started thinking, I'm a town of Islip guy. I was born in Southside Hospital, grew up in East Islip, but I spent a lot of time in Babylon over the years. And then I realized, I don't remember it, but when I was born, my dad was the park superintendent of what's now Robert Moses State Park, which is actually in the town of Babylon, if you look at the map real carefully. But, so I don't remember because I wasn't even 2 by the time he left there. And then over the years, I spent a lot of time hunting from Captree all the way up to Gilgo for ducks. My dad bought me my first shotgun in what used to be Babylon Sporting Goods, and now I think it's a surf shop. And I can remember buying a gunning parker there. So throughout my talk, as Babylon connections pop into my mind, I will point them out once again. So I'm going to do 3 things here today. I got involved in this through the Long Island Decoy Collectors Association, and I guess maybe Denise Valenti was the first contact they had there, and I heard about this. And what really drew me in was she said, oh, they've got this grass boat. And as you'll see, I have a bunch of passions in life: birds, ducks, duck boats, boats of any kind. So I often describe, because the boat was still in storage, she sent some photographs, and it was like if we were introducing the mayor and we sent a picture of her shoulder and her wrist. That's what I had for the boat, but that was enough to get me excited. So I actually got to see the boat, and today is the first time I've actually seen it kind of free and ranging free here. It's really an exceptional boat. So I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes. It is kind of at the back of the room, so I apologize if your neck is going to get a little stiff when I talk back there. But mostly what I'll do is I have a PowerPoint presentation which talks about the role of birds in my art. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been fascinated with birds. It gave me my art, my career, a whole lot of good friendships, and so you'll see how that fits in. And I have a bunch of my work here, both some carvings and some flat work, and I'll just introduce those briefly to you, and then when you look at them later, if you have any questions, we can talk at length, kind of one-on-one. So I'm going to just go back right now to this grass boat, but the interesting connection, it's already been mentioned, this really seminal book, Joel Barber's Wildfowl Decoys, published in 1934. That was the first book that really said, oh, there's something to these decoys. They're not just a tool that's used and thrown away. There's a lot to appreciate, and they're an important part of Americana, a very important part of our country's history. I read that, I think, when I was about 12 years old, and out of the East Islip Public Library. And one of the images that caught my mind in there was this particularly nice black duck decoy. It had a cork body made out of old life preserver cork, but gorgeous head on it. It caught my eye, and sure enough, it was by Ralph Cranford of Babylon, Long Island, New York. And we have one of his black duck decoys on display, and this boat belonged to Ralph, and I guess we don't know for sure whether he built it, but once I saw it, and I saw the kind of mind that designed and crafted that boat, and I knew that Ralph was an architect, that all kind of fit together. This wasn't some boat that was just nailed together to get out on the bay with. This really, lots of nice design details, some of which I had never seen before, and I've seen a lot of duck boats in my life, but a really exceptional one. So the Historical Society is very lucky to have such a vessel. They've kept it in excellent condition. you could hunt it tomorrow if you wanted to. So this is what's called a grass boat, and the reason it is to go out and hunt most of the waterfowl on Great South Bay. You were going to hunt out on the salt marsh, either on or next to or up inside the salt marshes. And what you wanted to do to surprise the ducks was to hide by looking like a piece of salt marsh. So you were going to go out in a vessel that was built very low to the water. You were going to lay on your back with your head propped up with a nice little board so you're not too uncomfortable. You're going to cover the whole boat with salt hay so that it looks like a piece of salt marsh. And so that's what a grass boat is. This one, again, dates back to 1918. I've restored a few boats in this era, but when I saw some of the features, I was really impressed with how well it was built and how well it was preserved. But so some of the key things are, I mentioned, I guess is this fastened to the boat? Okay. There's some bundles there of salt hay, which is one of the two major species of grasses that grow out on our salt marsh. And historically, you probably know, they were actually harvested for use by farmers on the mainland. They were cut in September, brought across the bay in big scows, and fed to cattle. But closer to my experience, it was always used, it was the hunters who went out and cut the hay in September or October and then covered their boats up with it. And I don't know this, but I think Long Island invented the idea of thatch rails, okay? And this boat has two ways of keeping the hay on the boat. On the back is a rack that is intended to carry decoys. And in fact, another name for decoy is stool. So it's a stool rack. And it has thatch rails on it. So you would have jammed salt hay in there and it would have stood up on end. And all around the cockpit, you had similar thatch rails. But what I'd never seen before, and what I saw in the photograph that Denise sent me, was this way of attaching thatch to the boat is a system of wires, either copper or bronze wire that was stretched all over, and then you would jam the salt hay under that and would stay on for the season. One other feature, you'll see we have them both deployed and undeployed. These are what are called oarlock stanchions, because there are three ways that you could propel this boat, four, I suppose. One would be you could row it, and I'll show you the oars in a minute. Once you were across the bay in shallow water, you could stand up and pole the boat, and there's a pole there, which we call a shoving oar. You could sail it. Unfortunately, the one thing that's missing from this boat is the sailing rig. And later in my presentation, I'll show you a Thomas Aikens painting that has a rig that's probably a lot like this one had. And then, as very often happens, sometimes you just get out and drag the boat when the water's really shallow. But anyway, you could do all those things. But this feature of folding oarlock stanchions, most people would associate with New Jersey. There's a famous duck boat, to the extent the duck boats can be famous, called a Barnegat Bay sneak box. And they always had folding oarlock stanchions. The idea was they fold down when not in use, and that way they're not going to scare the ducks. I've never seen them that actually had their own little thatch rails right on the oarlock stanchions. And if you come look at these later, one of them is up and propped in place for rowing. The other is down. But the workmanship is just superb. They do not rattle, they're not loose, they're just really, really well done. I mentioned that you could sail it. What you do have is what's called the mast step, or I suppose real particular guys like Bob would say, well, it's the partners and the step, because the step is down in the boat where the heel of the mast would sit. And what you would have would be a very small rig, probably a sprit rig. And I don't know if there's any sailors here, but it would be an unstayed mast. There aren't going to be any forestays or shrouds or anything. It's just going to be a small rig, and so you'd put your mast in, you'd sail across the bay or sail back home across the bay, and when you're gunning, you would just fold that all up and probably just set it right on the bog next to you and out of your way. It wouldn't fit inside the boat. But I want you, when you come up later, take a look at the workmanship on just this plug to keep water out of the partners in it. It's octagonal in shape. They've chamfered the edges. They've got brass rivets through here that hold the piece of cork on. And all these years later, it still fits just snugly, so you're not going to lose it. Again, you can't see it back there, but I do want you to come back later and walk around it, because you're going to see two things that you can't see here. On the bow, if you've ever seen tugboats have this massive cushioning on the front so they can push up against a barge or an ocean liner. And on a tugboat, they call it bow pudding. And back in the day, it was made out of rope. This is much more delicate. It's actually called a bow fender, but it's a piece of real fancy rope work. And it's just so that it protects the stem of the boat when you come up against a dock or something like that. But again, just some of the detail that you see. The decks, the whole boat is probably made out of Atlantic white cedar in terms of the planking and even the framing, I think. The decks are covered with canvas, because a wooden boat that's planked, if it sits out in the sun, the seams are going to open up in the hot sun. So you covered it with canvas and painted the canvas. The bottom of the boat, that wasn't necessary because you would keep that moist all the time and it wasn't baking in the sun. But again, when you come around, you'll see two things. The angle between the bottom and the side is called the chine. And we always hunted well into the winter here, so they protected that chine with some copper, because otherwise the ice is going to chew up the boat. Cedar is a very soft wood. Another thing that says it was used in the ice is there's two runners on the bottom, each of which is shod with brass strips, so that when the bay was iced up, you could get this thing up on the ice and again either drag it or shove it along with a pole and potentially even sail it. One other thing I wanted to point out, which I hadn't seen before today. Does anybody know what this is? It's cotton caulking. Now, anyone who's known boats in recent years or has worked on their own kitchen or bathroom thinks of caulking as some kind of, semi-liquid that comes in a tube. Well, the caulking back in the day was either, for small boats it was cotton, and for bigger boats it was like a tar-saturated rope called oakum. But anyway, between all the planks in that bottom, when they built the boat, they would have painted the seams with a thing called white lead, twisted this cotton and put it in there, and then forced the planks together. And again, when you look at the construction of this, the thing is just perfect. It's just tight. And after 5 years or something, it's just astonishing to me. This is called a shove-in oar. Okay, it's got a blade on one end. Otherwise, it's pretty much, and these would be 9 or 11 feet long. And that's, again, when you're across the bay in shallow water, as long as you have a hard bottom, you can stand up, because it's a flat bottom boat, it's very stable, and you can shove the boat along. You can see a lot better what you're doing if you can stand up. And once you get the boat running along, then you use the blade held against the gunwale of the boat and use it like a tiller, and you steer the boat that way. And one thing I was very happy to see when I saw these oars is these oarlocks on them. In the world of traditional boats, there's like two different warring sectors. One is those that believe in pinning your oarlocks, and those that think that's anathema. I'm a pinned oarlock guy, because when you're duck hunting, you want to be able to row along, pick up a down bird or a decoy, and let go of the oars and not worry about losing them. And so by having them pinned, and these are a real nice piece of hardware, and I wouldn't be surprised if they maybe came from like the St. Lawrence River or something like this, because the only other time that I've seen this on boats, it was St. Lawrence River, Adirondack guide boats, things like that. But really, really well-made set of oars there. So I call this celebrating birds with brush and knife. Ever since I can remember, I always had a pencil or a paintbrush, and later on a carving knife in my hand. And birds runs through my entire lifetime. And my prime influence was clearly my dad, who was a duck hunter. And he would bring home ducks every day during the season, and I would run to the entryway door and identify all the ducks. I literally knew the ducks before I was in kindergarten, all the ducks. And I also literally learned how to read from the Audubon Water Bird Guide. So I never really had a chance. And again, I was just hooked early on. Didn't happen to my other siblings. I was the one who got bitten by the bug. I still have that decoy, by the way. So again, we always had paper and pencils around. We were always drawing. And of course, you start out by copying. And two big influences on me. If you're a duck hunter, maybe, and my age, you might have a copy of Waterfowl Tomorrow, which the federal government put out, Fish and Wildlife Service. And the artist for that was Bob Hines, and he's a real, a duck artist, hero of mine. But the other one was Don Eckleberry, and where did he live? Babylon. And he's still, in terms of bird art, he's right up there in the pantheon for me. And I did actually get to meet him once, around 1980 or so. But then I mentioned, again, around the time I was 12 was the first time that I read Joel Barber's book. And these are kind of iconic decoys. The ones up in the left are some of the most valuable decoys on the face of the planet. They're by a carver in North Carolina named Lee Dudley. And I can just remember seeing that. My dad was a very accomplished woodworker. He could build everything out of wood. He built boats, everything else. Quite frankly, he was too busy to work on decoys, so he never really wanted to make decoys himself. But I said, I got to do that someday. And then right below that is my drawing of a Shang Wheeler, a goldeneye decoy. And Shang is, again, one of the biggest names in decoys. He was from Connecticut, but he won the first ever decoy show out in Bellport, which was 100 years ago this year. So, and then this fellow, Joseph Lincoln, I think from Accord or Accord, Massachusetts. I'm not sure how they mispronounce everything, Massachusetts. Of course, in New York, I live near a town called Greenwich. We don't pronounce it Greenwich. But anyhow, as you'll see, he had an influence on my style, or as you can see from some of these birds here. We came from a modest family. We didn't have original art around the house, but we had art around the house. It was prints. And so it was something that I always did and was always interested in. This one is just a part of me. It's right now sits right next to my dining room table. My grandfather, he didn't work on the bay, but he worked at Doxy Seafood in Islip. And he was behind the counter. And he also, back when it was a real skill to drive a truck, he took the fish into Fulton Fish Market, back and forth. And as a kid, I somehow got the idea that this is where Grandpa worked, but it wasn't, but it's a part of who I am. And again, from an early age, I've heard people detract from Audubon's art or try to. I don't know what they're talking about. He really knew the birds. Obviously he shot them, had them in hand. He was a very accomplished artist, and so he had both the accuracy and he had a real sense of design, which, in my opinion, too few wildlife artists have. So he's always be up in my pantheon. I went to Cornell to study wildlife science, 1971 to 75. And I hadn't actually heard of Louis Agassiz Fuertes before I went there. And he lived and worked in Ithaca at Cornell. Out at the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, they have a lot of his work, but also all the years I was there, they had different exhibits by different bird artists. And so it was really wonderful for me to go up there and just look nose to nose with this really great bird art and see how they did it and try to figure out how they did it. So someday maybe I could do it. So he's the one, if you look at the whole sweep, it goes from Audubon to Fuertes as far as I'm concerned, and anyone in between doesn't really warrant our attention. So I've spent a lot of time in the field being a wildlife biologist by both profession and avocation, always interested in birds. So whether I was hunting or just watching birds, you got to put the 10,000 hours in, you really do. Some of you here will probably recognize Mike Scheibel up there. It's my oil painting of him hunting at Upper and Lower Lakes several decades ago. Some other art influences that have nothing to do with birds or wildlife, but that I've always been drawn to, and they tend to be pre-World War II Americans by and large. So someone like Thomas Hart Benton, again, I'm not in a position to buy originals, but we have prints of these throughout our house to keep the inspiration up. And last year when my neighbors were combining wheat on our farm, it looked an awful lot like that. Part of me in a different life, I could have been a portrait artist. When I retired in 2010 from DEC, I gave it some serious thought, but then my past caught up with me, and it seems like I'm doing ducks and duck hunting and duck boats 24/7, 365, and I can't find the time. But John Singer Sargent and James McNeil Whistler, whenever I've seen the human face, I'm just really, really drawn to it, and love trying to reproduce it in oils. I worked in Buffalo, DEC's region, for a very short time. Hadn't even heard of Charles Birchfeld before, but as you'll see, people like George Bell, this is the whole Ashcan school, their mastery of light in otherwise mundane settings. And I guess the real famous one is, everybody knows Edward Hopper, but the light and the color and that emotion just comes through from him. So I don't paint as much as I'd like to, but these guys are in my head somewhere. And then more to sporting art. If any of you have been to the Shelburne Museum south of Burlington, Vermont, we talked about Joel Barber, kind of the inventor of decoy collecting. Well, most of his collection is at the Shelburne Museum in the Dorset House. But they also have Ogden Pleisner's gallery set up right there. So if you're up that way, it's worth seeing. But I'm drawn to artists who can get that feel of being a field. And one of my beliefs is everything's better in a boat. So if you can have a boat involved, it's always going to be better. And it's really, really hard. If any of you do any drawing and struggle with perspective, try to do the perspective on a boat with all its curves. It's one of the hardest things there is to get. Similarly, Thomas Akins, I mentioned before the rig that was probably on that grass boat would have been this, a short little sprit rig. So you got a short mast and then a little sprit holding a four-sided sail up. Again, no stays or shrouds. You just pick that rig up and fold it up, set it in the boat or set it on the bog. This particular one, the bigger painting here, is called Whistling for Plover. And my wife, now wife, bought me a book when we were in college, and I had never seen that painting before. And it's just, I have a print of it now hanging up in the house. I just love it. But the real hero is Winslow Homer. A lot of people consider him to be the greatest American artist. A lot of boats in his stuff. The perspective is always dead on. And I'm a sailor. I can feel the stern rising beneath me as I'm sitting at the tiller of that boat. He conveys that so well. And this one makes me think of duck hunting. Yes, those are herring, and it's called the herring net. But any of you who've hunted ducks, particularly diving ducks out on the bay, and you got a big southwest wind, and you got heavy seas, and you got to go pick those decoys up, there's a lot of work involved. And again, I can feel the boat coming up beneath me, and you're fighting the boat, you're fighting the wind as you're trying to pick up every last decoy at the end of the hunt. So after college, before I started my career in wildlife, I tried to make my living as a bird artist with limited success, but I did have a very nice spread in Adirondack Life Museum. It actually was published in June 1978. I started my career with DEC in May of 1978, so the timing wasn't perfect that way. It just so happens these two paintings, the first time I ever went to a meeting of the Long Island, not meeting, the annual show of the Long Island Decoy Collectors Association. I didn't have any decoys to sell, but I had a bunch of bird paintings, and I sold these to someone who lived up west, and actually his son contacted me a couple of years ago. At the time, though, seeing my competition like Robert Bateman, you kind of think, should I just give up? Because there's some excellent painters out there. When I did move to Long Island to work for DEC, I had never heard of Al McCormick. And when I saw his decoys, that was really inspirational for me, because a lot of the wooden and factory decoys that I had seen, I always knew, boy, that head's too skinny. It looks like they cut it out of a 2x4. Duck's head is fatter than that. And then when I saw Al taking his head out of a piece of 4x4 red cedar with big fat cheeks on it, I said, yes, that's the right idea. So I never carved with Al, but I certainly admire his work and took some inspiration from it. I don't do just birds. I like to paint a lot of different things. Yes, I didn't know Mick Jagger, but back in my college days, I copied that from an album cover, I think. I live in a beautiful part of the world. It's in Washington County, New York, between like Albany and Bennington, Vermont. And we have a farm up there. My wife's from northern New York, so we had always wanted to buy a farm between the two families. And this, if you come over here later, you'll see this piece of cypress. It's a half-size tundra swan, and that's the handle on my shop/studio. So that's where I spend my days. I built that just before I retired. Susan does all the flowers. And one thing I did as soon as I retired is I joined what's called the Saratoga Life Studio. So for about 3 years, I would go every Monday night for 3 hours, and they would have a model, and the model would keep the same pose for the whole 3 hours. So what was nice was you could do a drawing, you could do a watercolor, you could do oil if you wanted, because you had enough time. And it was great because I got to be with other artists, but also I really progressed rapidly once I was there. As I said, I have real interest in doing portraits. The time may run out before I really get to that, but this was just, that was one class sitting there doing the model. And what I tell myself, if I could do that every time, I'd be a happy man. I'm very pleased with that one. But what I've done, much less demanding, and when I can find the time, is I do in watercolors. I do some note cards. Some of them have nice old antique decoys, some of which belong to club members. And then I play around, with colors and composition and such. That's my sneak box in the town of Babylon. I'm not going to tell you where. I want to go there next year and see all you people at my spot. But one thing I did, the first time I ever went to a decoy contest was in Babylon. I think it was the Masonic Hall back in, say, 1965 or 66. And I have a lot of vivid memories from that, but one of them was a fellow that had a bunch of miniatures, kind of like John Lee Baldwin did. And I said, I got to do that someday. So the first one I ever did was for a friend's son who spent his whole life in a wheelchair and more. And when I asked Patty, what should I get him for his 18th birthday? She said, something he can look at. So I made a mallard, flying mallard that could hang over his bed. And then this one, it hangs in my shop and will always do so. I actually made it for my dad in his last year of life, it turns out. And I was going to give it to him on his birthday in April, but it wasn't good enough. I didn't quite like something about it, so I said, well, I'll make him another one. Turns out he died May 31st that year. But before he died, I brought that into Southside Hospital and hung from the TV arm in his room. And he couldn't talk anymore, but he liked it. So that'll always stay there. I do a lot of pro bono work for in the name of birds. It's now called the Grassland Bird Trust near me, about a half hour away. And so the executive director approached me and said, she heard I had a shop. She said, oh, could you do some cutouts of these different birds? Not realizing there's no way I'm going to do cutouts and let somebody else paint them. So I did these, and I kind of love to do this kind of painting because it's just like painting hunting decoys. You're in more of an impressionist mode. You're not in that meticulous, painstaking mode, so you can knock these out pretty fast. And they're still used for educational purposes all the time. Another big passion of mine is boats. There's nothing bird-like about this particular one except the type of boat is called an O'Day Osprey, but I restored that for a friend. But more importantly is I have found ways to build bird motifs, especially duck motifs, into different boats in a practical way. So this is a little 13-foot canoe that I made, and I wanted the bow handle to be practical, so it's a sleeping duck. The bill isn't sticking out where it could get broken off. And sometimes it's just an excuse. So this is an open bay boat, we named it White Wing, and that's a White Wing Scoter sleeping on its bow. And in some ways, this is probably the best thing I've ever produced with these two hands. It's for a friend's big 34-foot cabin boat. And so there's handrails either side of the companionway, but I built in a pair, a hen and a drake, broadbill sleeping out of mahogany. You always have a concept of what you want to do. You don't always achieve it. When it happens the way you want it to, it's a great feeling as an artist. So my partner Craig was here earlier today. I built the pilot house on his boat. It's a 25-foot boat that his dad gave him. And we wanted it comfortable in the winter, so we made a little shelf for the cook stove with a drawer in it, and when it's folded up against the wall, sure enough, we got a pair of broadbill flying in front of the lighthouse on Great South Bay. Finding my style, and any artist has a breakthrough moment. This was a bird for me. I've been drawing goldeneye, which we gunners call whistlers, my whole life. Never was happy with one. I had an order from a friend. I carved that bird. I said, finally, I got it. And before I delivered it to him, I kept this and I carved another one just like it because I couldn't let it go. So that's on my business card. If you look at my Subaru in the parking lot, instead of the Subaru logo, you'll see that on the front and rear of my Subaru. But the style I've developed, this old school is right over there on the shelf. I combine a couple of things. Being a boat builder and a lover of traditional boats, I love curves. So I make sure all my carvings really, give a prominent place to curves over and above what might be there in nature. I'm a biologist by training. I have a pretty good eye for drawing. I know what they really look like, but I override that and impose curves when I want to. And so what I try to do is, a round bottom decoy is an abomination when you're actually hunting. But on the shelf, nothing looks as good. So these are what I call my mantelpiece birds. Nice big voluptuous shape. Fair curves, that's a boat building term. A curve that has no lumps or bumps or hollows in it. Just a perfect mathematical curve. And then what I do I mentioned Joseph, what was his name before the...
Lincoln.
Joseph Lincoln, thank you. I loved his paint jobs because they were what I call very diagrammatic, very hard edges, patches of color here and there. I mix it up because there are parts on a bird that you don't want to give that oversimplified look to. So this old squaw has some really harsh transitions from dark to light, but the face, you can't do it simply. You've got to put some subtlety in there. Same with the speculum. So I mix them up. On the other hand, there's a few where I really want to paint in every feather. So the pintail is one of the fanciest, most elegant birds we have. And I've often thought if you look at this design and think of the classic pineapple motif in early American furniture, I see a similarity there, just the way everything plays out there. And it's a lot of tedious work, but it's worth the effect, in my opinion. Not just ducks, I love shorebirds. These are all shorebirds, a killdeer, yellowlegs, and a whimbrel. I've done a couple, I did some owls for a friend, and part of the problem I have with them is duck and shorebird decoys, when you carve, I only carve with hand tools. Once it's sawn out, I carve with hand tools. The grain of the wood kind of tells you what the shape of the bird should be for shorebirds and for ducks and geese. But once you get away from that into things like owls, to me, they don't really mix that well. As mentioned before, I do a lot of teaching for free on my website. I'm not sure what the next slide is. Let me see. Okay, so for instance, the carving a mallard body tutorial. I have one that's just for the head. And it starts out with a block of wood and showing you how to draw a center line down a piece of wood. That sounds oversimplistic, but not everybody had my dad. I knew what to, I could take that for granted, but I know that a lot of people didn't. So I start, and very quickly, once that was posted, it got up to like 500,000 posts, hits on the, and you don't really know how many different people that is because carvers are going to go back to the site, more than once, so you really don't know. So, I like to think it's, 250,000 carvers. My wife thinks it's one very slow duck hunter. So, we'll never know. And then I have a lot of, Steve, I was telling you, these painting tutorials. I don't have them for every species, but I've got them for probably 10 species for gunning style paint jobs. The paints to use, and you start from the tail and you work toward the bill. That's how you paint them. And I tell you the brushes to use and the paints and everything else. And one of the things that helps everybody, because I have been doing this my whole life and trying to help other people learn how to carve and paint. The biggest hurdle for most gunners that don't have any art background when they go to decoys is matching colors. Really, really difficult thing to do if you haven't done it your whole life. The solution? Home Depot sample jars. I have the sample jars for every color you need. You don't need to do any mixing. I'll give you the name and the code, and you just go to Home Depot and buy yourself a little jar of it. So, a little detour happened almost 4 years ago now. My friends, probably since around the late 70s, I was known as Captain Fowler. I coined that term for myself in gunning mode. But then, in 2019, I had to change my name because I lost my vision in my right eye. And so now, inspired by John Wayne in the movie True Grit, I now go by Rooster Foghorn. And I only wear the patch for driving. I don't need it otherwise, but it does help a lot when I'm driving. So I was just finished painting a couple of pretty fancy decoys. And what you learn when you lose vision in one eye is you lose depth perception. So it only really matters from like 0 to 5 feet. But when you're doing fancy work and you don't know when the brush is going to hit the decoy, everything takes a little longer. However, we mentioned Joel Barber a lot. Just just after I lost the vision, my wife and I went, there was a big show about him at the Shelburne. We got to see it. And I took a lot of pictures, and so that's the first bit of flat work I did with one eye. And I was very satisfied that once I hit the paper, I still knew what to do with the brush. So I'm happy with that. And this blue-winged teal is a decoy I carved back in March or so. So I can still do it, it just takes a lot longer. So thank you very much for your attention. Again, I welcome you to come up, look at the decoys, ask me any questions. You're welcome to pick them up gently and look at them. And these are gunning decoys, some of which are not yet done. This wimble here, I've probably got 3 or 4 more days to finish that with paint. It's ready for the finished coat, but that's where all the time goes. So, thank you very much.